I don't share my Oreos. I once lived in a very old house, owned by my ex-husband's family for generations. I had a really bad habit of snacking at midnight. One night, I was happily enjoying some Oreos and milk around midnight. No lights on. I had 3 small children at the time, who would have been drawn to the light and the cookies, so I was eating in the dark. I should clarify, there were plenty of moonlight to maneuver throughout the house. Suddenly I looked up, and standing right in front of me was an older man in a wife-beater type undershirt and boxer shorts. His hair was thinning, and he was a bit on the heavy side. He had this quiet blank stare. I ran to the only place I could, the bathroom. I stayed in there for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, then made my way back to bed, turning on lights as I went. Not even worried about waking up my children at that point. When I told my husband about it the next day, he was shocked. He showed me a picture of his grandfather, who had passed years earlier in that house. It sure did look like him. His grandfather loved midnight snacks. Oreos were his favorite. I guess he just wanted me to share. I don't share my Oreos. My toilet cleaned itself while I was gone. I know where else to post this. I have always felt that there's been some degree of haunting in my apartment. Dozens of things have disappeared without a trace. There was flooding with no source. Electronics stopped working for minutes or hours at a time, and then just go back to working again. But this one was a new one. My girlfriend was out babysitting, so she wasn't home. I leave my apartment at 6 p.m. and don't get back until about half past midnight. Before I left, the toilet was nasty, had stains in it and needed to be cleaned. It had been about a week. I came back after being out all night. Apartment is still locked and everything, but the toilet bowl has been cleaned. Edit. Check the trash. There was only one in there, and it was from earlier in the week. Toilet cleaned itself, and there's no physical evidence. I did not clean that toilet. And literally, the first thing I did when I came in was to take a piss. I mean, it's not bad if a ghost cleaned my toilet. Fucking sweet, but why? This is not a joke. But my toilet was actually mysteriously made sparkling. Odd laughter. My first actual story, but here it goes. So my buddy and I are walking my school track at like midnight, and let me go ahead and point out there is obviously no one there but us. We get to the farthest part of the track, and the mosquito spray guy comes down the street in his truck. Now, as the truck gets closer, out of nowhere, we hear what sounds like screaming, laughing, and shouting all at once from the bathrooms, which is opposite from the truck. It sounded like a whole group of kids. It went on for a good 30 seconds, and we heard it over the guy's truck who was passing through. It was so loud and guttural that it sounded completely real. Our first thought was, holy shit, someone is getting raped or killed. So we run over to help somehow. Keep in mind, the whole area is pitch black, minus the one streetlight over the track. We split up and check both bathrooms and find no trace of anything at all. We search the whole area and find nothing. We were positively the only ones there that night. This is a low-traffic, rural area with no other cars. Can somebody please help me debunk this somehow? Sorry if this story was choppy. Haven't written in a while. Sobbing mother ghost. A family friend of ours, we'll call her M, had my family over for dinner one night. I hadn't seen her for a while before this. I'm currently 18 years old. While my parents chatted, M and I somehow started talking about spirits. Now, M is an Aboriginal elder, and with that status comes certain responsibility when it comes to speaking about the dead, I believe. She implied she shouldn't be talking about ghosts, but had a scary experience when she was younger and chose to tell me about it. My town is pretty old, and the downtown area is full of houses 100 plus years old. You can't really fit new houses downtown, honestly. This happened probably in the 90s, I assume. She was working as security or something in a very old apartment building. On one of her shifts, she started hearing crying coming from her room. She was near an area with a lot of uninhabited rooms, so she checked them, but found nothing. This obviously freaked her out, so she returned to her sitting area. The crying eventually went away. A few nights later, around midnight, the crying starts, and it gets sadder and more painful. Em lost her son a while back, and she told me the crying sounded like a mother that had lost a baby. That sort of sorrowful, heart-wrenching sadness. Then the crying got louder. It was coming near her. At this point, Em, who is very strong, just stayed in her chair as the crying entity walked past her. She couldn't see it, but the presence was strong, and it was obviously walking right by her. The entity walked into the kitchen, which apparently had been a child's bedroom before being remodeled, stayed in there for a while, and eventually went back up the stairs and left. Such a sad story, and feels as if the spirit was searching for her child. Ghosts are scary, but when it comes to stuff like that, it really breaks my heart. The Growl. About a year ago, I started dating someone who worked as a state park ranger who I'll call Jay. Now, Jay lived on the state park property in a 2-bedroom house tucked into the woods. We set the alarms and settled into bed around midnight, with Jay's 2 dogs between us and a 3rd dog crafted beside the bed. And for some reason, I couldn't fall asleep. So I lay listening to the dogs snoring and the deafening silence surrounding us while Jay slept. And then it started. A repetitive bouncing sound of some sort was coming from outside the window, less than a few feet from where I was laying on the bed, as if someone was dribbling a basketball on cement. The pace would speed up and slow down. The sound would become louder and softer. This continued for well over 2 hours. I was wholeheartedly wanted to believe that what I was hearing were simply sounds of nature, so I ignored it. Next came the creaks in the walls. I know that houses make sounds, but this was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. These sounds started in the hallway as very, very faint creaks. The creaks became louder as they reached Jay's bedroom, and would happen on one wall at a time, going counterclockwise around the room, until it eventually reached the wall beside me. The creak in the wall beside me was so loud I jumped, and the 2 dogs jolted from their sleep. All the while, I'm still hearing a bouncing ball outside the window, and I'm getting more nervous by the minute. And then at 3 a.m. I hear it. I hear the most ungodly, terrifying growl shrieking from the center of the house. It was so loud that Jake flies off the bed, grabs a shotgun hanging on the wall adjacent to the bed, and shouts, "Is somebody in the house?" and takes off down the hallway towards the sound. The dogs are going berserk, and I'm in tears, absolutely beside myself, pleading with Jay that it was not a person. Jay comes back into the bedroom after not finding an intruder or anything of that sort, and says it must have been one of the dogs. I tell him it was certainly not one of the dogs, as I was awake the entire night and the dogs were asleep in the room with us. Maybe an animal got caught underneath the house. Yeah, maybe, I say. Somehow, after I've calmed down a bit, I drift off to sleep. The next thing I know, Jay is on top of me, with his hands around my throat, with the meanest look on his face, jerking my head back and forth, suffocating me and hurting me. I can't make any sound, and I'm struggling to push Jay away, and that's when I wake up. It was all a vivid dream. Jay is asleep beside me. In the morning, we walk into the den to find the heater turned on full blast. It was the middle of summer. Jay only uses it during winter months, as it is the original furnace, and quite tricky to operate. I'm convinced something in that house did not want me there. That growl will forever haunt me. Creepy apartment. My boyfriend, our 7-year-old, and myself have been living in our apartment for over 5 years now. Although I have numerous stories about weird things that have happened, these few are by far the creepiest to have happened to us. When we first moved to this apartment, things seemed pretty normal for the first little while, other than the fact that my daughter would refuse to go into the bathroom by herself, no matter what time of day. After a few months, my boyfriend was working his evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., and I was home with our daughter. As I was laying down with her trying to get her to go to sleep, she sat up suddenly, pointing to the corner of the ceiling above her closet and said, "Mommy, what's that?" As I was telling her I didn't see anything, her finger started tracing the ceiling in a zigzag and stopped just above us. At this point, I was freaking out. I grabbed my daughter and brought her out to the living room. I let her sleep on the couch while I sat with the lights on, waiting for my boyfriend to finish work. About a month went by with no incident, and I forgot about what happened until one day. When my daughter was playing in her room, she ran out to me quite excited. I asked her if she was enjoying her new room. Her reply left chills down my spine. She had a huge smile on her face and said, "Yes, Mommy. I like playing with the boy and girl, but the monster scares us." I just looked at her and said, "What monster?" To which she replied, "The one that stays in the bathroom." I honestly didn't know what to think when I heard that, but it helped understand why my daughter was afraid of being in the bathroom by herself. I told my boyfriend what she told me, but he just shrugged it off as a child's wild imagination. I might have too had this next incident might not happened. I was laying in bed one night. It was around midnight. My daughter had been fast asleep for 4 hours or so, and I could hear my boyfriend in the living room watching TV, so I know I was still awake. As I was laying there, all of a sudden, I felt extremely heavy. I couldn't move anything but my eyes, and then, that's when I heard them. Coming from in front of my bedroom closet, I heard whispering and laughing, as if a group of kids were huddled in a group. I lay there for a few minutes, trying to wrap my brain around what was happening at that moment. I could hear them talking, but they were talking all at once, and I couldn't make out anything being said, except for the occasional giggle. After a few minutes of this, I finally managed to find some balls, and out loud I asked who's there. Suddenly it felt like I had numerous eyes on me, and slowly the whispering and laughing died away. Within another minute of the voices leaving, I was able to move again. I'd never been so freaked out in my life. The last terrifying incident occurred to my daughter. Last year when she was 6, she hadn't mentioned the boy or girl for some time at this point, was in the kitchen doing dishes, and she was playing in her room, but it sounded as though she was talking to someone. I could hear her ask a question, then wait, as if she was listening to the reply. The shrillness in her voice is what made me stop what I was doing. I heard her get up quickly and all of a sudden say, "I'm telling Mommy." I could see her shadow on the door, and could tell she was coming out of the room when she just flew out and hit the wall as if someone had pushed her. I ran over, picked her up, and asked, "What the hell just happened?" For 15 minutes, she just stood there looking at me as I kept asking her what happened. Finally, in the tiniest voice I ever heard, she said, "I'm not allowed to tell." At that point, any fear I had evaporated. I was pissed. No one touches my daughter, let alone tell her she's not allowed to tell her mother something. I barged into my daughter's room, and if there was a spirit, they sure did get an earful. Using God's name, I commanded anything in that room to get the fuck out. They weren't welcome here anymore. I even went out and bought crosses for her room, and a Bible now sits on her nightstand. My boyfriend to this day doesn't believe anything I've told him, but I know the things I've seen and heard, and in my lifetime, I've never hallucinated. My daughter no longer mentions the boy, girl, or monster, and I don't feel like I'm constantly being watched. But we are currently looking for a new apartment. My experience with a Naga. When I was living in an apartment in Mazatlan, Ohio, I had experience with a very demonic spirit that I found out later was a Naga. I personally can feel spirits, but my husband has the ability to see them. When we moved in, everything was fine. Then my neighbor got a package from her older sister in Japan, and the attacks started. All in the attic in our apartment series were connected, so we figured out later that that was how it was getting into our apartment. The attic entrance was in our laundry room. It started out really small. I would just get really tired or feel like I was being watched. I would get scared for no reason, and my husband, a very calm guy, would get furious over everything. I started not being able to go to sleep near the closet in our room, which was connected to the bathroom, which was connected to the laundry room. And I had to have my back pressed against my husband's, and even then I could not sleep a lot. It came to a head when I had what I thought was a nightmare, but I don't think I was sleeping. I was being choked by an unseen force, and I was screaming at it, calling it a bitch, telling it to fuck off, just really nasty things. But when I tried to call for help, my voice would be gone. It was after that I started looking for a new place to live. My husband and I moved out the next month. We were working at the time, my husband working from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, and we could only get our stuff after work, getting there about 9:30, leaving around midnight. The last night I ever went was our third trip. Most of our belongings were already gone, and I had to do a quick cleanup. We walked in the house and turned on all the lights. I started cleaning while my husband packed the car. About 15 minutes in, the lights in the living room started flickering. 5 minutes later, they went out. Figured it was a faulty surge in light, but I refused to go and check because it was in the laundry room, and I stopped going in there before we even started moving. Next was the kitchen lights. These were right next to the laundry room, flickering then off. The funny thing is, our bedroom and bathroom lights were still on and going strong. I wanted to leave right then. Husband wanted to get the last parts of his stereo into the car, so I stood by the door and took the speakers he handed me, shoved them in the car and sat down, put my seatbelt on, and refused to move. He brought his in, then went to go and lock the door. The next part he told me about, and I believe him. When he went to shut the door, he heard the attic door open and slam shut. He quickly slammed the door, closed, but felt something pulling the door open. He saw the face of a woman with the body of a snake, and in his head felt the deepest hatred he has ever felt. Whatever it was wanted him dead. He used the last of his strength to shut the door, turned the lock, slammed the screen door, and almost flew into the driver's seat, started the car, and refused to talk to me until we were almost home, about 15 miles away. I swear, he just ignored the speed limit, and his face was white as a sheet of printer paper. I never went back to the apartment, and to this day, I suffer from anxiety over what happened. We figured out it was a Naga from Japan, and was feeding off of me because I could sense it, and I was afraid of it. Odd ghost ball occurrence. I have had an encounter with a ghost, not a human, but a hamster. When I was 11 years old, my parents bought me a hamster, and then my brother bought a hamster ball for it. We would almost always keep him in his ball, since it was most amusing to us. Fast forward a year later, and the little guy passed. Not long after that, I can't remember exactly when, I was up at midnight playing my brother's Game Boy Advance SP in his room, which was connected to mine. Everyone else in the house was asleep since it was around 1 a.m. Just as I was about to go back into my room, I saw my hamster ball roll by the doorway and bump into the wall. I clearly heard it and got up to investigate, only to not find anything there. It just vanished. The next morning, I find his ball under our porch. So it was impossible for it to have rolled into my room the night before. Just wanted to share this odd ghost happening. I don't think anyone else has seen a ghost hamster. Have anyone else seen anything like this? The Forest Prison. In August of 2016, after high school graduation, a few friends and I started doing paranormal investigations to pass time. We conduct an investigation every summer and occasional winters. but the summer of 2017 was bizarre. There's one area we love to go to, an abandoned prison camp area in the forests of Massachusetts. During this expedition, we got there just past midnight and immediately got bad vibes. As the location is one of the most haunted in the country, we ventured down a small dirt road to a graffiti-ridden cement building, which was comprised of roughly 6 solitary confinement cells, so it was rather small. While 2 of our team members were going to one side, my friend and I, who we'll call B, were crammed in one cell and asked questions to see if any ghosts would reply on our audio recording device. We had a lengthy session when I heard footsteps in the nearby tree line, and there was no one there. They got closer, closer, and closer until I thought they were right next to me, and they were so loud. Apparently, our other team members heard footsteps too, but instead over by our car. We decided to hightail it out of there. After reviewing the audio, there was one moment when we caught a disembodied voice. B asked, "Is there anyone who belonged in this cell?" And a muffled whispered replied, but we could not make out what it said. We put logic above the paranormal and approach every scenario as skeptics, and I firmly believe that we caught something paranormal. Spooky shenanigans in Ohio. Back in 2004, I went with my friend and his fiancée to visit her parents, who live in a semi-rural part of Alliance, Ohio, and at night, he and I would crash on the couches downstairs. It quickly became apparent we were not alone down there. Over the course of the following week, we would notice strange orbs darting erratically across the rooms and experience brief but abrupt fluctuations in room temperature. Books and other items were left on the coffee table the evening before would sometimes be elsewhere in the room the following morning. More than once, one of us would get up and go use the bathroom, only to discover that the lamp in the nearby study had unaccountably turned itself on. Damn things on again became a routine observation. On another occasion, we found that our cell phones, which we had left charging on the floor in the dining room, had been stretched across the room to the ends of their cords in a way clearly intended to get our attention. In a similar vein, we once discovered his fiancée's purse, which she kept at all times by a nightstand by the front door, was sitting prominently in the middle of the floor. Not long after that, I was investigating what had sounded like footsteps in the adjacent hallway. Finding nothing, I turned to go rejoin my friend in the family room and promptly slammed face first into the now open door to the linen closet, which had been less than 2 steps away and shut tight mere seconds before. Another time, we had just turned off the TV and settled in for the night when we both heard the distinctive sound of glassware tinkling together in the general vicinity of the breakfast nook. From his vantage point on his couch, which happened to face directly into the kitchen, my friend spun his head towards the sound. To this day, he swear he caught a quick glimpse of some shadowy figure peeping out at us from the kitchen bar archway. There was the night we kept hearing the distinct, rhythmic tapping sound that appeared to have no discernible origin. It initially seemed to start from somewhere up in the chimney. After several minutes of listening to this, we got up to investigate, and within seconds, the tapping resumed on the other corner of the room, this time sounding like it was coming from somewhere under the floor. At one point, it seemed to be coming from outside. I have a long-held theory that what many people will automatically assume is a haunting will more often than not turn out to have a rational explanation. But in this case, the best explanation we would come up with was that their reclusive, octogenarian neighbor was out back, chopping wood in the pitch dark at 3:30 a.m., making a rational explanation in this situation no less unusual than simply accepting as it was a haunting. And yes, we did open the back door and look outside. All was quiet. The sounds were definitely coming from inside the house. As we stood there in the darkness, Trying to figure out the puzzle of these unknown sounds, the radio on the counter across the room suddenly clicked on, and as we looked on it, stunned disbelief began to increase in volume. I can still recall the song playing. It was Nelly and Tim McGraw's Over and Over Again. As the volume counter steadily intensified, we feared it would become loud enough to wake everyone upstairs. For several frantic seconds, we flailed around for a light switch and a volume control. Finally, in desperation, we yanked the cord from the wall, thus sparing ourselves the unenviable position of having to explain to his annoyed future in-laws why they had two dudes crouched on their family room floor on their hands and knees in the dark, blasting love jams at 4 a.m, while his fiancée and her mother seemed genuinely surprised and unsettled by our reports of our nightly misadventures. Her father, on the other hand, who traditionally was a bit of a night owl and had a tendency to stay downstairs by himself long after his wife and daughter had gone to bed, would be bemused and smirk ruefully as if he knew something. On that particular visit, however, he never actually admitted to anything. That changed the following year, when we were all back in Ohio for my friend's wedding. The day after the wedding, my friend, his now new father-in-law, and myself were sitting around outside their backyard fire pit, drinking beer and talking about the wedding, when the father-in-law took advantage of a break in the conversation to bring up the hauntings we had been talking about the year before. He admitted to us that he had indeed experienced some unusual phenomenon in his house over the years. It turned out that he, too, had incidences with the lamp in the study that had turned itself on. He had at one time been sitting at the kitchen table late one night, smoking on a cigarette and working on a crossword puzzle, when he clearly heard what sounded like high heels, or perhaps a men's dress shoes, walk across the kitchen tiles less than 5 feet from where he was sitting at the time. Now, his most jarring encounter had happened a few years ago, when he had been working late in his detached garage, which is located several hundred feet from his back door. Finishing his project for the night, he was walking back towards the house when he caught a brief glimpse of what he initially assumed to be his wife or daughter, walking across the family room in the direction of the kitchen. Surprised that someone was still up at this hour, he became even more surprised when he got inside and realized there was no evidence of anyone being downstairs with him. Now thoroughly confused, he went upstairs and found both of them soundly asleep. As we all sat there comparing notes on our collective experiences, we began to see some similarities. Without exception, all the paranormal activity was confined to the downstairs area, the family room, kitchen, and study in particular being hotspots. There was never anything particularly ominous or malevolent about the hauntings. Mostly it seemed to be mischievous or prankish in nature. I've never known of ghosts to work in shifts. Nonetheless, the hours the hauntings were confined to had us all scratching our heads. While you couldn't set a watch to it, and some nights were more active than others, if at all, it seemed that activity would start up anywhere after midnight and could potentially continue to any point until roughly before daybreak. Nothing was ever seen in the daylight hours, as far as anyone could tell. Precisely who was haunting the house was even a bigger puzzle. The house itself was not that old, built in the late 70s. There had been only one other previous owners, and they were alive and well on the other side of town. There had been no tragedies or accidents on the property that anyone was aware of. One thing his father-in-law noted was that the activity seemed to have started not long after he had been given an antique ceremonial rod, which had belonged to his great-great-great-grandfather. A full-blooded Shawnee of the great stature in his tribe, he kept the rod on display in the study, which, you guessed it, was in the same room with a lamp with a mind of its own. My friend and I liked this theory. It seemed as good as any explanation as any, and it also provided a reason as to why the hauntings were limited to the downstairs area. Also, having the notion that the spirits was family, albeit distant family to his wife, made it all seem a lot less freaky. Haunted Farmhouse. This is my first post ever, so bear with me. Since I was little, I've always seen or experienced unexplainable things, ghosts, sleep paralysis, etc. But this story has stuck out the most to me. A couple years ago, I was visiting my mom and her new husband. Her new husband owned a bunch of land in Texas. The property had been owned by his family for over 100 years, with many deaths occurring on the property. I'll tell you about the property and then I'll tell you about my story. From what I understand, his uncle died in the house, his grandmother hung herself in the barn, his ex-wife also died in the house, and I'm sure others did too. To add to all of this, there are unmarked graves on the property. Sometimes while plowing the land, one of the tractor's tires would fall into an unmarked grave. Apparently, an army used to be camped out on the property, probably during the Civil War or right after it, and one of the officers was a very irritable person and would shoot anyone that would piss him off, so there's graves scattered all over the property. There's 2 graves right by the front door of the house to add to the creepiness. Anyways, I went to visit this house for the first time after they got married. As soon as I entered, I could tell that something was off about the house. My mom, who is also into the paranormal, started telling me about all the shit that she would see. She would see his dead uncle sitting at the kitchen table, and 2 children's spirits that would scratch her and his ex-wife. She also told me that the bathroom had burned down by a space heater catching fire that wasn't even plugged in. All this crazy shit. So that night, I was too freaked out to sleep, so I stayed in the front room watching TV with all the lights on. All of a sudden, the power goes out. So it's pitch black in this room at like midnight. I turned my laptop on so that I had some light, but I was still shitting bricks. Then I started hearing footsteps outside of the room behind the blanket they had hanging up over the doorway. After sitting there for a few minutes unable to move from being so scared, I finally got the courage to run past the blanket, down the hall to my mom's room and start pounding on the door that the power had gone out. She gets up, goes to her front room and sees that the neighbor's power was still on. She opens the front door, yells at the spirit to turn the power back on, and no joke, the power goes back on as soon as she said it. Let's just say, I never ever stayed at the house again. Paranormal slap in the face. Backstory. My dad killed himself when I was 2 years old. I only ever saw a few photos. Until my sister said what she said. I was strictly a non-believer and wrote off all paranormal as entertaining fantasies. When I was 14 years old, my parents decided to move from our hometown to a town a few hours away to start afresh. My older sister 18 and older brother 21 moved in together to save some cash on rent, as my sister had just had a baby to a less than caring partner. After a few months of settling down, I went to visit my siblings back home. My sister and her partner had reconciled over the prior weeks, and he moved in to help support her and the baby. On the nights in question, I was sleeping in the lounge room. This lounge room sat closest to the roads, both at the front of the house and the one running down the right side. The house was built near a busy intersection that was famous for its terrible design. As I sat there gaming, a close friend rang my phone. We talked hours about school life and whatever else, and then things got weird. I was laying on the futon, which at 3 a.m. felt impossibly comfortable, still talking nonsense to my crush when I looked out the window. Standing there under a streetlight was what looked like my dad. Exactly as he was in all the photos. He didn't flash away like a horror movie villain. He stood there for about 8 seconds, not moving or speaking, until at the last moment he moved. He moved as if to catch a dropped plate, like a man who had just seen his last chance to convince a lover to stay with him slip away. A man who knew even before you lost that he lost you. I hung up the phone. It's been years and I didn't think anything of it after a while. We all know what midnight does to a person's mind, after all. It was a few days ago when my family and I were sitting at Mom's having a bite to eat when we started talking about houses. When the house on the corner was mentioned, my sister laughed a nervous laugh and said, "That place was haunted, no question." My brother and sister then spent 20 long minutes telling me of strange occurrences they had, plates breaking in cupboards, bags of flour exploding, items being thrown, footsteps in the night, and 101 other little bits of classic paranormal activity I didn't know about. They still didn't know and still don't know what I saw, but now I know that they experienced something. And I'm wondering if maybe what I saw was something more than a late night daydream.